at the University of Louisiana. And there's a Voegelin Institute out there now to carry on his work. One of his most famous works is called Order and History. And it's a multi-volume work, but it covers a lot of the history of political thought as he analyzes it. Well, Eric Voegelin is famous for using his own terminology. So, I want to borrow a few of those terms, but not all of them, because I think that Voegelin goes a little bit far in this regard, and he almost invents his own language. But there are some terms that he uses that might help us to understand his point about contemporary ideology and how socialism can fit into that. Voegelin says that human life, from any period of time, is characterized by search for what he calls the transcendent. Okay? So in ancient times as well as today, human beings, as part of their nature, search for the transcendent, that is, that which is beyond them and above them. Okay? And in his view, this is a psychological and probably a spiritual need that people have to search for that which is beyond them and to try to understand it or make contact with it somehow. So for all time, people have come up with ideas of a moral order that they cannot quite achieve, and have come up with ideas of God that far outstrip what human beings can be. Now, Voegelin says that what modern ideology does is it attempts to immanentize the transcendent. Let me spell that if I can. If you run this word through your spell check, it won't be there because it's Voegelin's word. To make something immanent means to make it in the here and now. So that's a word, right? But to immanentize is something that's not quite in the dictionary. Ideology tries to take the transcendent and make it here and now. Okay? That's what Voegelin says. Another word that he uses is he says, it attempts to make what is transcendent mundane, which means worldly. This is what characterizes modern ideology: the attempt to take what has always been transcendent and to bring it into the world. Okay? Now he points out that because of this, the spiritual and the psychological background, okay, that modern ideologies can and do take on the characteristic of religious movements. That the type of faith that people can and do place in religious beliefs can be transferred to ideological movements. Okay? Another person who makes this observation is Carl Jung. Not the same era as Sigmund Freud. Okay? But unlike Freud, Jung dealt a lot with religion. And he was of the same opinion that in the past, this natural desire that people have had been expressed through religion, but in the modern world, there was this alternative of worldly ideology, but that what made the ideology so attractive and so potentially powerful and transforming and even able to get people to do things they might not otherwise do is that religious quality of it, or the quality of seeking the transcendent or the perfect, our vision of the perfect in the here and now. Okay? So Voegelin says that modern ideologies are like Gnostic movements. And by Gnostic, there is Gnostic Christianity, but by this he meant secret, underlying, hidden meaning within the ideology. Okay? In other words, socialism says, for instance, we want to make everybody free, equal, and happy. Underlying that is this desire for perfection in the other world, a desire that's previously been a desire for God. Okay? socialist thought does indeed see deeper meaning in a lot of events and interprets history not so much according to the events themselves, but according to what they really mean, in relation to the ultimate goal of socialism, absolute equality. Okay, so Voegelin claims that this mindset is characteristic of the modern world, then, this attempt to search for the transcendent in the world, the attempt to bring heaven down to earth. All right? Now, Voegelin then says man's natural existence, man's natural state, is what he calls in between. And he means by that in between the transcendent and the worldly. Okay? Because we are spiritual and reasoning beings, but we're also animals. Okay? So we have always occupied this uncomfortable space, as he puts it. You know, our existence is neither up here in heaven or totally here in the world either, unlike all other creatures, because of our ability to reason and think beyond ourselves. We can glimpse and understand part of this, but we can't live there. So for most of human history, we have lived in this in-between, okay, where we experience our animal nature, such as our self-interestedness, our desire our tendency to violence, all of those things that you can think of that are more of the animal in us. And we have tried to somehow tame those by keeping our eyes on the transcendent, which is the moral ideal too. Okay? Well, Voegelin says if we tried to obtain the transcendent and to live there, so to speak, what we would have is we would be sort of lost in some sort of religious ecstasy or some sort of vision of total perfection, and we wouldn't be human beings anymore. Okay? Because occasionally this happens to people, and they become something else. You know, they become unworldly or otherworldly in their nature, and they no longer behave and act like most of the rest of humanity. Right? But it's kind of rare. On the other hand, if we become all the world, then we basically become like animals. We lose any sort of restraint. We lose any sort of ideals. We become very dangerous to ourselves and others. Voegelin says that we remain in the middle for the most part because we are both spirit and body. And it's our bodies, the fact that we have bodies and that makes us individuals, that keeps us usually from climbing up that ladder. Okay? Now, his view is that modern ideology, those modern Gnostic movements, as he puts it, attempt to eradicate, attempt to destroy this uncomfortable in-between status of human beings. Not by making people into saints necessarily, but rather through identifying their desire for the transcendent with the mundane or earthly political movements. Okay? So, Voegelin concludes that at their base, ideological movements such as socialism, communism, and even, perversely, fascism are spiritual in nature. And he and Jung both suggest that it's almost, it's obviously not a good use of the spirit. In other words, it's a sort of psychological maladjustment. Right? Because you can't, in his view, in neither one of their view, can you achieve perfection on earth with imperfect people. And yet, for quite a long time, we've been exposed to ideas that expect just that, expect perfection from imperfect people. Okay? All right. Any questions about Voegelin, first of all, and what he says?
They suggest that the modern ideologies might push us to expect transcendence.
Yeah. Right. Expect us to transcend our human condition. Expect transcendence in this world. And the pull, the emotional and psychological attraction of that is so strong that this explains why you get mass movements, why hundreds of thousands and millions of people could become so devoted, right? That they would, attempt to, in very short order, transform their entire society. Okay. Obviously, this is one theory, but it's a theory that helps in this particular subject matter as we move through utopian socialism as opposed to scientific socialism. Okay? Because with utopian socialism, the very first people who came up with socialist ideas were Christian theologians. Okay? So, in fact, that's the origin of utopian socialism, is in Christian theology. You can see, I'm sure, how tempting that path would be. Many of Jesus' teachings have to do with moral perfection, with giving away everything you have, or turning the other cheek, doing things that do not come readily, to our instinctual selves, right? And anybody who's read that thinks, well, you know what? The world would be a wonderful place if everybody did that. But then, of course, then you think, well, yeah, but unfortunately, not everybody does that. So how can I do it and survive? How can I do it and actually continue to be safe and effective and so forth? Okay? Even before Christian ideas emerged, though, we have an earlier example of utopian socialism in Plato. And Plato's ideas, in fact, sort of merge, actually, with Christian ideas in somebody like St. Thomas More, who understands both the Christian ideals and the ancient models of utopian socialism. Some of you have probably read Plato's Republic, right? Okay. Well, among a lot of other things, it's an example of ancient thought on the subject of communism. Okay? I have a different reading of Plato's Republic, and I don't think it's really about a proposal about communism at all, actually. But certainly, the least we can say is that for a lot of people reading it, it was exactly that, and it was really a daring exploration of just how equal people can be and what it would take to make that happen, so that every member of the society thought not about himself or herself, but only about the common good. Okay? Does anybody remember who in Plato's Republic practiced communism? Was it everybody? And if not, who was?
Wasn't it just the warriors, the defenders?
Mm-hmm. The warriors, and then the philosopher leaders that came out of that class. Yeah. So it starts with that, what calls the silver class, who are supposed to devote their entire being to protecting the city. Right? And one of the great qualities that these soldiers are supposed to have is absolute loyalty, because you can't have this class thinking about their own interests when it comes to defending the city. Okay, whether that be their own their family, their private property, or their own emotional reactions to their duty. Okay, so Plato says that the ideal soldier has to be dog-like. No matter what the city asks him to do, no matter how the city treats the soldier, he has to be absolutely loyal, like a dog. Okay? So the way that this is achieved is to take away all property. Does anybody remember how extensive that is? How far does the communism go in Plato's Republic? It goes beyond just property.
Didn't they share their wives too?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The community of women, as Marx calls it, but actually, depending upon who's writing about this, It can either be sharing wives or sharing husbands and wives, okay? But the idea is that there will be no marriage, no propriety over your spouse, okay? And actually the state will conduct, the planning as to when mating will happen, because the point of that is to produce the best offspring who can continue to lead, all right? So there's all sorts of rules regarding when they will actually come together and in order to produce the best offspring. Those offspring that are undesirable for whatever reason can be exposed, which means killed, okay, or put down into a lower class. Okay. The children also raised communally. Once the child is born, it's taken away from the mother and raised in a common area so that the mother doesn't know whose child, which child is hers. Okay? So this is all designed to remove these people from any sort of personal interest. To be able to say, this is my wife, or this is these are my children. Okay? So that everybody, and this is the reasoning in his case, everybody can be your wife and your children. Okay? Because you don't know who exactly. So you should think of all women as a member of your family, all children as your children, and so forth. Okay? And in that way, you equally wish to protect them all. Mm-hmm.
So would you just have to be born into this class, or did people from outside this class ever enter? Because I just don't see a woman earning into this kind of life.
Not that the woman wouldn't necessarily want to, especially have her children taken away from her. Yeah, there's two ways that you can get into this class. One is being born into it, in which case you would be raised with this system in mind your whole life. Or the other way would be he does provide for some people with extraordinary talents in the bronze class to move into the silver class, and from the silver class into the gold class based upon their merit. In which case, I guess they would have to choose. They wouldn't. There is no sense of forcing people in this system, but there is a sense of, you might say, strong socialization in the silver and gold class, because the content of their education is controlled. How they are taught their religion is very controlled, so that only those models of goodness and altruism are represented. Plato was critical of the way the gods were depicted in Greek theology, because they were often too selfish and violent and so forth. So they would be coerced in the sense of receiving a constant stream of the right types of teachings. Okay. Now, for a lot of students, this doesn't sound too good. You think, like you just said, why would any woman in particular want to go and do this? Because there seems to be such a strong bond between a woman and her child. There's a pretty strong bond between a father and child, too. But, when you give birth, you certainly wouldn't wish to have your child basically taken away from you in the next minute. So I think that's a very valid concern and question about this system. It's always made me wonder if this was a real proposal or whether it was something else that was going on, especially when you see in no other Platonic dialogue does the proposal get this extreme. Okay. However, like I said, it has been a model for future utopian and socialist thinkers, right? Because of the basic message. Ideally, you don't want people thinking about their private interests. Ideally, you want them totally devoted to the common good, right? And it's the idea that the more that people are attracted to their private interests, the more harm they will do to the community. Now, we've seen in liberalism and in conservatism, actually, that in the modern world, the competing ideology says, no, actually, self-interest and individualism and so forth can actually benefit everybody. So that's the other side of the coin, right? This belief that, no, it's not harmful necessarily. When people pursue their own private interest, everybody can benefit. All right? Well, the socialist doesn't see it that way, okay? But sees cases where individualism and private interest and selfishness hurt people. Okay? And so their ideal is to, get away from that as much as possible. Okay? Now, an early critic of socialism was Aristotle. He agreed with his teacher on a lot of things, but he didn't agree on this issue of communism at all, and he took him on in the politics. And he took this proposal pretty seriously as at least an ideal for the way people should live. And Aristotle said that basically there's one thing that human beings can't just give away or alienate themselves from. And that's their body. We inhabit a body. Right? Now, what does that do for us? The fact that we're not, let's think like science fiction for a second and imagine that we could possibly be just a big blob, totally unified. No body, no particular feelings like the Borg, in the Star Trek series. Okay? What is it about having individual bodies that would be different from the experience of being a part of the blob, okay, that matters that much that somebody like Aristotle would say communism is impossible?
You want to upkeep your body and keep it in good shape and healthy.
Mm-hmm.
That on your mind, or the blob, that wouldn't even be any sort of priority.
Yeah, you wouldn't be thinking about your particular body at all, right? Because you would, that individuality wouldn't exist.
It provides the basis for the type of thought that leads us to believe that we are not, always focused on we do actually have something of self-interest. We have concern for ourselves and our own body. We experience that on a daily basis. So you can't just remove that idea because you always experience it. Mm-hmm.
It's the birthplace of self-interest and of individualism. And, self-interest for somebody like Aristotle is not necessarily bad. Okay? It can be bad if it becomes selfishness. Right? But self-interest in his view is so natural because of this very thing, that you have an interest in your body more than anyone else's because you alone can feel it, right? I mean, if he uses this example of something, I don't know whether it's his fingers or toes or what it is, but if you break some part, let's say you break your arm, okay? Does everybody in the community feel it? No, I mean, that seems like common sense, and it is, but it's really fundamental in his view, too. Not everybody feels it. Okay, they can sympathize, but they can't feel it. So you're going to be much more concerned about getting medical care for your problem than anyone else. Okay, and that the priority, in fact, your duty in this case is to do something for yourself. Nobody else will in a lot of cases, or even if they will, they certainly won't make it as high a priority as you would. Right? The body is the source of pain, of pleasure, of all kinds of feelings, all of which intimately relate back to you as an individual. And so Aristotle said, because we can't share that, we will never be able to get away from the individualism to the extent that Socrates wanted. No matter how much, in other words, no matter how much socialization we do and how much teaching we do, we can encourage people to be good people and share and so forth, but we can't make them totally reject their individualism and alienate themselves from their own interests and think differently. He didn't believe it was possible. Okay? Aristotle reasoned if this is the case, then we can't get away from the existence of our body and its implications, then we must accept private property. Well, why would that be so? Why is it necessary if we are individuals because of our body? Why does it necessarily follow that we need private property?
Could you argue the body your own property, but your self-interest is protecting your own body.
Yeah, Locke made that explicit. He said, first property is your body, but because of people will have a natural interest in protecting themselves, they need much more than that to protect themselves against others. They need to be able to acquire property.
Yeah, I was just going to say to secure your surroundings, to maintain that your body's going to be not harmed more than if you were just living communally.
To secure your interests. Very good. It's only natural that people will want to have those things that everybody has always desired to have in his view. Shelter and enough to not feel vulnerable to everything that happens, every act of nature, every act of human beings. Okay? Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that, as Locke concluded, that people should then be able to accumulate as much as they possibly can. That doesn't follow. But at least it follows then, if you accept Aristotle's reasoning, that property is necessary, okay, because of our individual concern with ourselves, which is natural in his view. All right. Aristotle countered Plato by saying, because of this natural self-interest that we have, what we need to do, rather than trying to turn people into perfect people, is to constantly remind them of their moral duties to each other, which need to be balanced against their self-interest, so that we moderate their behavior. And of course, we've already discussed this a little bit. Aristotle's cure for making people better, despite this, is not philosophy for most people, becoming a rational philosopher like Plato, but rather habituation, good laws, good practices, making people get into the habit of caring for each other, being good citizens. Okay? All right, so there you have, in ancient times, an example of communist thought or socialist thought, an example of an argument against it based upon individualism and private property. And really, this argument, goes back and forth throughout the rest of history and is expressed in different ways. Any questions about Plato and Aristotle? Anything you're curious about? Okay. You know me, I always like to go back to these ancient. I love that much more than just about anything else.
Benjamin Franklin's idea of habituation, that comes from Aristotle directly?
Not maybe directly, but I'm sure that, I think it's clear that there's an intellectual influence there, that need to practice what you're going to do. It reflects very closely Aristotle's view that you can acquire good character from the outside in. The first step is to decide you're going to do something, and then by doing it, you sort of become it after a while. So it definitely does, and Franklin was a very well-read man. So, definitely there's some influence there. Anything else? Okay. Well, another thinker, which is in your book, but I didn't assign because we studied it also in the introductory class, is St. Thomas More, and he's a great example of a Christian utopian socialist. And one of our churches in town is named after St. Thomas More. He was a chancellor, an advisor to King Henry VIII. Okay? And as you know, if you know anything about King Henry VIII, those were not too good of times for anybody who was trying to advise a king. More's dates, by the way, are 1478 to 1535. And he wrote Utopia, the book in question, in 1516. Okay? Well, Thomas More is famous for refusing to go along with King Henry VIII's demands for divorces, and eventually getting executed as a result. Okay? So that's why he became a martyr and why he became a saint. But curiously, there's this book that he wrote in 1516, when he was still in the good graces of the king, that gives this wonderful vision of a utopian society in which private property is abolished. And I'll just tell you a little bit about it to kind of refresh your memory. But the central character, the person doing the narrating, is a man named Raphael, who's from England. And Raphael has traveled all over the place, and one of the places that he encountered, which is off the maps and nobody knows about it, is Utopia, an island nation, and he describes this island nation. He's back in England and he's describing it, and he's describing it by way of contrast with England, which he believes is deeply flawed by comparison. Okay? England has all these problems of poverty and crime and ridiculous jail sentences for petty theft and just gross injustice in his view. Okay, it's hard to argue with. And then Utopia has fixed all of these problems and is living. These people are living in a much more humane and just and rational way. In Utopia, private property has been completely abolished. And so here we see with St. Thomas More, even before liberal theory emerged, socialism was reacting to basically liberal ideas like the right to private property, like free and open economic competition, and basically saying those things are not good. Owning your own property, trying to get more property, trying to be rich, it hurts other people. And we would all be better off if we could change, if we could first, think about what is rational and then live that way. Okay? Does anybody remember what the primary purpose of Utopia was? Why were these people all living this way? What is the ultimate good that they were pursuing?
Security.
Well, they wanted security. That's true, and that's good. It was a means to an end, though, because they do talk a lot about their training for war. They've got an island that is impenetrable. They make alliances with neighboring cities, and all of those actions are designed for security. But that's definitely a means to an end. Well, peace.
Peace.
Peace. Hopefully for the people living there.
You don't want to be influenced or tainted by stuff like that.
Right. They want to be pure. Okay. And that's clearly, they try as hard as they can to keep those influences out. One of the influences that they talk about is the influence of the desire for wealth and for gold and silver and jewels and so forth, that so much of the rest of the world values, the signs and trappings of wealth. They make illegal, basically. Adults can't use these things. They turn gold into chamber pots. And children can wear jewelry, but after a certain age, it's illegal. Okay, and it's considered just a childish thing because they don't want people valuing things which, in their view, are basically useless. Okay, what does a pearl do for you? What can a gold chain do for you? Okay, so the utopians don't value anything that it doesn't have a real purpose in providing comfort and security and well-being for people. They all wear very plain clothes because they don't want to expend excess energy in coloring and in fine fabrics and so forth.
Are they only referring to physical comfort and physical security? Because sometimes things like jewelry or mementos or maybe a ring that a grandmother gave to you right before you died can provide emotional security for you. So are they just referring to the physical aspect of all that?
No, I think that he's referring also to the emotional security, although you've brought up a good point that there are some pieces of property that are not just about, feeling wealthier or more luxurious, but have a significant meaning. But he's thinking that it's a sort of almost an emotion or psychological illness to be so consumed with interest in things that don't really provide you with anything good. And of course, he's thinking of the courts of Europe, that have basically, in his view, impoverished people so that a few people can have lots of this stuff, which they then don't do anything productive with. It's unproductive in his view. So he doesn't really address that issue of, it seems like a pretty rigid system, right? But they say no property, none of these baubles and trappings. Even the houses are pretty much exactly alike, okay? Because the evils that come from people distinguishing each other based on their wealth and based even on their other attributes like creativity, okay? So, but the ultimate purpose of utopia, okay, is actually leisure to enjoy intellectual pursuits. Okay? If you remember, the thing that was encouraged the most was intellectual and I guess other such, things like listening to lectures, art, music, reading. And so this, this was the vision of a utopia that was thought up by a scholar. Okay? Leisure, for many of us, is sort of a good in and of itself. We think, leisure is good, regardless of what we spend time on. Okay, it's up to us to decide what we want to spend our leisure time on, but we know it's good to have it. But Thomas More said leisure is good for, bettering yourself somehow. That the purpose of life is bettering yourself somehow. And so utopia is all about encouraging people to better themselves as much as they can. All right. You may recall they had slaves, but one of his ironic messages was that the slaves in Utopia would be happier than the poor in England, and so people actually volunteered to be slaves in Utopia because they were treated better than the average laborer in England would be. That's an obvious device just to say how bad it is in his own country. Right. Now, More's utopia carries with it some common socialist assumptions. Okay? First, that much of the labor in capitalist society produces useless things. Okay? Let me see if I can write this down quickly here. Much of the labor in capitalism produces useless things. That's because it will produce whatever there's a market for. And a few people get very wealthy, and so they go after things that even they themselves don't need at all, and certainly don't do any good for anybody else, okay? Such would be, like in today's world, the plasma TV, You've got, as a commercial for Burger King or one of those places is now, giving away potentially plasma TVs to somebody, and there are these huge TVs, like movie theater size in your living room TV. Well, the socialist tends to look at that and see excessive consumption, okay, or somebody who wears furs. Okay, what good is that? Leave aside the animal rights issues and so forth. The socialist would say, wearing a $20,000 mink is definitely a waste of value, okay? And so I think our society would look, it would look strange to St. Thomas More because he'd never expect the wealth to be spread out this much, but he'd still see a lot of spiritual illness in our society because there'd be so many people pursuing stuff that doesn't, that they don't need. Yes.
Can you say that a lot of that stuff has aesthetic value, though? Mm-hmm. If art is still an important pursuit, beautiful clothing and beautiful jewelry, it's you want it because it's beautiful, it's artistic.
Yeah, and we admire a lot of past civilizations precisely for those things that they produced that were beautiful, right, and lasting and so forth. Yeah, socialists have a tendency, we see this with Marx and Engels too, in basically demoting beauty. Okay, they don't know what to do with the issue of beauty, because they see that throughout history, beauty has been created through the excessive accumulation of wealth. They know that they want to get rid of this situation, and so they then say, we don't need beauty, or beauty is not important, or we need to stop valuing this as much, which they don't really want to do. I mean, Marx and Engels don't really want to do that, but that seems like a result of a lot of what they write, is they do kind of deny what they're saying, that there's an aesthetic value, you know. Now, obviously, you could say, well, what about a plasma TV? But, you know, but there's still a lot of things that we do have, right? For instance, the way that we dress, which expresses our individuality, our individual tastes, and our notion of beauty, that is not highly valued, you know, the expression, the individual expression in art. Not if it has to do, you know, with using money in this way. And for the most part, you know, when you think about it, no matter what system, you know, look, you know, now we have a lot of grants, government grants, instead of direct patronage, you know, for the arts. But still, there's a lot of money funneled into things that very few people can really see, you know, or appreciate. And the socialist points that out. You know, what it's just not worth it when there's lots of other things that can be done.
This may be socialist.
Well, I'm sort of mixed feelings on that question. I do think that. No, I don't think socialist thinking entirely is on its way out. If you look at most of the European countries, they're a mixture of capitalism and socialism, with people in the democracies making fairly heavy demands upon their state to provide. Canada would be another good example, to provide, you know, universal health care, for instance, and this is the will of the people in those countries. So democracy and socialism can go together. And I don't see the strength of that waning. Obviously, the strength of communism is on the wane and doesn't appear to make sense to an awful lot of people who don't want to go there anymore. But this combination of democracy and socialism, they have quite a bit of life. You know, we don't, in this country, we have a sort of political, cultural ideal of independence that is not as strong in a lot of other countries. But perhaps the notion that we can achieve perfection is gone, you know, because I think we've, at least for the time being, we appear to have learned the lesson that when you do that, too many other things that are valuable to us are destroyed. But does anybody else want to give their opinion on that question? That's a good question. Mm-hmm.
I think the United States itself is moving.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, there's evidence of that, and there's evidence that you know, you can have both, or that a lot of societies are choosing some mixture of the two. I mean, pure socialism is, you know, the government ownership of the means of production, or the government ownership or heavy regulation of, you know, the industry. But democratic socialism maintains, for the most part, private enterprise, but regulates it, redistributes property, makes sure that everybody has certain essential things, and so forth. So, yeah, I mean, you know, our country right now, you can see it in the presidential election here, is really split, I mean, almost exactly evenly about which direction it wants to go. About half the people, I think, want to move more towards that model, and half the people don't, okay? But certainly that's an advance, I think, for those ideas over what we used to see. Anybody else want to try to take a whack at that? Okay. Well, so that's one point in which the utopian socialism of Moore and other utopian socialists shares common assumptions with others, including Marx and Engels. Another is that the idea that all should work in some capacity. All should contribute productively. And of course this comes from that time when you had this leisure class that literally didn't do anything except for own property. Okay? Now in the dynamic capitalism, you have, you know, capitalists that spend a lot of their days actually trying to make more money. So, you know, but probably still those socialists would see them as living a life that excludes labor, that doesn't know what labor is really all about. And of course, they would be using what work that they did do in order to take what is rightfully the society's as a whole and not theirs as individuals. Okay, so there's this concentration on work, and we'll see with Marx and Engels that really they think all should be liable to labor. You know, that everybody should experience this. St. Thomas More certainly did. He even went so far as to devise in his Utopia a rotation system, so that, you know, people would spend time in the city, but they would also have to spend time in the country doing farming. Everybody would experience at some point in their life manual labor, even if for the most part that they were scholars. Okay, so there's a valuing of that, of manual work in particular. Now, almost all of them, including Marx and Engels, would suggest that there are those people who cannot labor, and they're exempt. Okay, so we're not talking about forcing people who are ill or invalids or handicapped into work, right? But with that exception, work is good for everybody, and it makes people feel a part of the larger community instead of separate from it. Okay, then they know that they're contributing to it, and they know how everybody else is living. A third idea that they share is the idea that the cause of crime is poverty. Now, the England of More's day would generally say, no, the cause of crime is perversity, you know, sin. And the cause of crime is that there are certain people with no character, you know, who go around, be lazy, they don't work hard, and they try to take from other people. And so the cure is for them to, you know, be straightened out somehow. Okay? Moore says, no, for most people, the reason why they are led into this degrading life in which they feel that they must steal or sell their bodies and so forth is poverty. It makes people desperate. Okay? And so if we eliminate poverty, we will eliminate most crime. In his view, the leaders of England had it all wrong. You know, they were not seeing that they themselves were producing a situation in which there was rampant crime.
Do they see any opportunity for perversity to explain, such as when someone who is rich or who does have is not poor commits crime?
Yeah, I think they do. I mean, Thomas More certainly saw that. You know, immorality is also caused by excessive wealth and by selfishness and so forth. Okay, I think the people, in his view, the people in those positions didn't see what they were doing as crimes. But you're absolutely right that, you know, a person in that position not only could do immoral things by exploiting other people, but can be corrupt politically or in their business and so forth. The socialist tends to not spend as much time upon the moral failings, right, but rather on the material circumstances. And so somebody like Marx and Engels would say the system is set up so that everybody is corrupted, basically. The rich, because of the capitalist system, are encouraged to be exploitative and corrupt. The poor are encouraged to commit crimes because of their desperation.
Is this the origin of have-nots, or was that created before this?
Well, I mean, that notion of the haves and have-nots comes from the socialist history. Yeah, that focus on who's got the private property and the unequal relationship between the two. Certainly, I mean, I don't know exactly if you could say it comes from Thomas More or not, but you know, it comes from that. I mean, you know, Christian theology. Even before Thomas More, with St. Thomas Aquinas, was talking about the fact that oftentimes poverty was an ameliorating circumstance, mitigating circumstance to crime, because it so often caused crime, and you had this unjust and immoral relationship between the rich and the poor. So I think you can say that it generally comes from that origin. Okay. Fourthly and finally, they share the idea that freedom comes from economic equality. not from the right to vote necessarily or any sort of political participation. And in fact, political participation can get in the way of equality, right? Because the socialist looks at democracy and sees how badly it is often abused by the rich, to manipulate people. Today, the special interests, the corporate interests, and so forth, are shown to be, more influential in the political system than just the average person, and that complaint is leveled a lot. Okay? And not just from socialists, obviously. So it's the idea that, democracy is not a cure-all. Okay? Economic equality will level people and create equal amount of power with or without democracy. But really, with Marx and Engels, democracy was a dangerous thing, okay? Because it could so easily be turned against the people. It wasn't rule by the people. It was rule on top of the people. So that, democracy was not their solution to the problem. Rather, we need a system that really represents the people's interests. So St. Thomas More's Utopia is not democratic. I mean, there's levels where people choose their leaders, but there's other levels where they don't, where the elite group chooses. Okay? There's no direct democracy in Utopia. Now, I guess you can say what Voegelin would see in this, again, is that attempt to immanentize the transcendent, right? In St. Thomas More's case, he's got a Christian ideal, okay, which is a true ideal. Everybody should share. People should think more of others than of themselves. We should not waste money, right, but use it to help people. Interestingly, More does not make Utopia a Christian city, but rather abstracts that, okay? And almost sort of takes the Christian principles into the rules by which they live. Okay? But the utopians aren't even Christians. Now, I would just suggest that perhaps his ideal is that people actually live Christianity, and that if they did, maybe the formal trappings of it wouldn't be as important. Okay. All right. Anything else about St. Thomas More that you're curious about? Mm-hmm.
What does we know what the purpose of him writing exactly was, or?
Yeah, to criticize England, to criticize the social situation of the poor people in England. I mean, that's his primary purpose. And he thought that he could do it at that time because the king was being sort of lenient towards the group of humanists that he was a part of. That we're trying to sort of gently push the aristocracy towards being more humane.
I think what I kind of get hung up on is why he made it like that the purpose of the people's lives was the leisure and the pursue higher education. Because that's the part that is inconsistent with his Christian beliefs, and why he didn't bring that through there or whatever. Kind of is that not self-interested a little bit, or?
Well, it's individualistic at that level. I mean, that's the level at which people can be individuals in his system, is that they're supposed to somehow improve themselves and cultivate themselves. And you're right, it's not cultivating their Christian character, because the Christianity is pretty much left out of it. And I think it just reflects St. Thomas More's particular emphasis on the intellectual life. That he values that much. I think that the humanist type of thinker thought that the more that people knew, the more that they cultivated their character and their intellect, the better that they would be. And he does talk about when Christianity is introduced, that many of the utopians are attracted to it. Okay? But it's not going to be the official state religion. It's going to be an option, but that it's not a bad option. It's a good option in his view. It's just that it is surprising that More didn't make it a Christian utopia.
This is a real remedial question, but can you clarify for me what the basically broad strokes differences between socialism, communism, and fascism is?
Okay, sure. Usually when we use the term socialism now, we're referring to some system that is less than the total takeover of the state towards the economy. Okay, Communism is reserved for the total takeover of the economy and of the control of people's lives. Back in, say, the days of the mid-19th century, when Marx and Engels were writing, and before that time, socialism and communism were interchangeable terms. Okay, so that causes some confusion because I'm using socialism and communism interchangeably because of that. Okay, but with the experience of Soviet and Chinese communism, these terms came to be used to describe two different things. Socialism exists with some element of popular rule, some private control of the economy, and the question is how much. In a socialist country can have almost total takeover of the economy as long as there's popular rule still. Okay, communism takes the position popular rule isn't necessary and actually can be harmful, and therefore you have this total takeover. So that's what's come to mean. Fascism, it's actually kind of complex. In some ways it comes out of socialism, but it's got elements of racism. It's got elements of sort of messianic hero worship and so forth. So we'll have to talk about that when the time comes. But in the case of fascism, if there's a takeover of elements of the economy, it's for the purposes of the power and glory of the state, explicitly, and not for the purposes of the betterment of the people. Okay. Everybody understand that? Okay. Yeah.
I want to ask, how was Moore saying that all of this was administered? I mean, who decides what work you do and how much you need?
Well, it's a complicated system of many layers of authority, some of which are priests of the religion that it's still sort of pagan, but it's the most brainy religion, you might say. And then there's the other officials who are selected from the priests. And then you've got other officials who are selected from leaders within the various provinces and so forth. But it's clear that there's two sources of the plan, okay, which is what you're asking about. One is the founder. He talks about Utopias. He's the founder. And he sets out the Constitution. So basically, he's the one that comes up with the leadership plan and also with the values, okay. And then the other source would be the priests, the people who are the most intimately connected with making sure that people continue to live this way and have the right values. Okay? Neither one of which have any popular, representation. So he knows that without a good founding and without reverence for that founding, people will never be able to stick with this type of idea. Okay. Well, we're almost out of time, but let me just talk a little bit about Robert Owen. Robert Owen is a utopian socialist. He was one of the readings for this week. And he's an interesting character. He wasn't the only wealthy person to try to start up a socialist community. Okay? There were several such people out there during the 19th century who tried to take either a factory or, in his case, a mill, or even a small town, and transform it into a socialist community. There were lots of those experiments. Well, he was one of them. He was very wealthy. He owned his own mills, cotton mills. But he was also an intellectual, and he had this vision of socialism, which he believed was the future for everybody. Okay? Now, keep in mind that he's writing this is the address to the inhabitants of New Lanark. It's a talk that he gave to the people working for him in 1800. So he's not far from the Enlightenment, from the French Revolution and from the Enlightenment thought. And actually, this type of utopian socialism is what I previously referred to as radical egalitarianism, one of the offshoots of liberal thought. Okay? There are certain ways of thinking about liberalism that lead you towards socialism, because if you emphasize equality greatly, then you need more than just, say, private actions. You have to have the power to equalize. Okay? So anyway, what he did was he tried to, instead of just employing his workers for minimum wage, he tried to give them what we might call a living wage, but also to provide them with, schools for their children. Took care to make sure that they had proper housing, and as much as it applied, health conditions to make sure that things were sanitary. Okay, and actually this worked. Okay, a lot of the utopian towns failed over time because people would drift in and out and not stay focused on what they were going to do. But in this case, it worked. Okay, the people stayed. They worked, they liked it, okay? The children were greatly benefited by receiving a proper education. He continued to make a profit. And he would funnel a lot of his profit back into helping his workers. Now in 1813, Owen actually had to buy out his partners in the mill business because they didn't feel like they were making enough money on their investment. So he did. And then he went and found new partners that were willing to take 5% per year. That was the way that he could actually have enough money to continue to take care of his workers the way he wanted to. But the truth is that it worked. Okay, it remained successful for many, many years. Jeremy Bentham was one of the investors, famous utilitarian, who just thought this would be a good experiment, something to try, see if people could do this. Now, as I said, Owen also established other communities, and one of the most famous your book mentions briefly at the beginning is called New Harmony. It was in Indiana, and it was founded in 1924. So perhaps, with the Great Depression looming on the horizon, this was maybe, not the best time to do this. But anyway, it didn't last very long. Okay, and a lot of the other communities didn't last very long. Partly because it was just hard to keep people there, and as I say, focused on sharing and on working together. Okay? And perhaps the mill system worked because everybody could see that it was in their interest to cooperate. They were getting a lot of good things. He was getting a profit as well. All right. In Owen's address here, there are several themes, and I'll have to wait until next time to really talk about them, but there are several themes here that coalesce around the idea of man as malleable or as manipulable. Okay? What he does is he takes some of the old, what Marx and Engels call eternal truths of liberalism, and he turns them around and says, no, people aren't naturally this way, they're products of their environment. And if they're products of their environment, then we can manipulate that by changing their environment. Okay? The first one, the one that I'll just discuss briefly, is that the idea that it's in the power of every individual to form his own character. Okay? That is a liberal idea, more or less. The idea that every individual has within his power the ability to choose his values, to form his own character. But Owen disagrees. He says, no, character is formed for and not by the individual. Okay. How is that? How can that be? How could he see it that way? In what ways have your character been formed without your consent? Your parents, how they raised you, right?
Society values.
Society. All the different influences from TV to public schools to any school, formed you. And before you know it, before you can really think as an adult, you've already got instilled within you a lot of your values, and the experiences that you have formed a lot of your character. So Owen is speaking sort of as a sociologist in a way here, and he's saying, look, it's just not true that we can choose to be whatever we want to be. We are largely shaped by what we're given. Okay? And if that's true, see, and this is the characteristic socialist reading here. If that's true, then we can do it differently. What we put in is what we get out. So if we put in better values, if we emphasize not selfishness but sharing, if we emphasize what's reasonable, then that's what we'll get. So we need to work upon how we raise people, how we educate people, and how we order our society to encourage certain opinions and behaviors and to discourage others. Okay? So it's this power of socialization. So when we get back, we'll talk about that, and also Bellamy's vision. Bellamy's book is looking backwards, 1887 to 2000, and it's the idea of, in his view, what would America look like in the year 2000? And it was going to be a socialist paradise. And actually, in 2000, there were a lot of book reviews of this book, because people realized, hey, it's 2000, let's check and see, what he said. Well, so I hope to find a few of those and bring them in. But anyway, about out of time. We'll see you on Thursday.